Thanks, John. Hello and welcome to the next part of Reinvigorating Corporate Purpose. We're going to discuss practical ways to make sustainability and ESG more than just a tagline, and instead a tangible measure of change. It's hard for companies to execute change and substantially alter pathways that have been accepted for so long, but increasingly aren't anymore. Sustainability is no longer just a footnote or an afterthought for companies. It's become an essential part of the fabric. I'm delighted to introduce my panel of speakers. Joining us today, we have Lydie Hudson, the CEO of Sustainability, Research and Investment Solutions at Credit Suisse, Robert Metzke, the Global Head of Sustainability at Philips, and Rob Opsomer, Executive Lead, Systemic Initiatives, the MacArthur Foundation. Thank you all for joining us. I'm hoping that we're going to have a very casual conversation today and unpack so much about a word and a term that we hear about every single day. All corporates, companies, all statements, increasingly will carry the word sustainability. So I'd love to start with kind of unpacking the term and what it means beyond what's written in reports and what we see in press releases. And I'd like to go around, the room and really think about, and if quickly you could define how your firm and how you think about sustainability. Lydie, I'd love to start with you. So in short, what does sustainability mean to you as somebody who is overseeing these solutions for clients and for credits and for Credit Suisse too?
Yes, thank you for having me. It's great to be here with you today. In fact, you're totally right to suggest that sustainability can be thought of in at least two dimensions for any issuer or any corporate, and that's how do we create sustainable solutions for our clients, and how do we create a more sustainable future for ourselves as a corporation. And really, our strategy around sustainability is to think through that along the dimensions of climate and environment, social, and governance. This is particularly relevant in a world of COVID where the social topic came up to the fore much more as we saw the fragility of society, the fragility of our economies and our healthcare systems. Sustainability had typically for many years been mostly focused on environment for good reason. But really it's thinking through each of the E, S, and G dimensions. And we just saw all of the activity around COP26, of course, which I know we'll talk about more, but really E, S, and G for our clients and for ourselves. And that is really long-term hard work, thinking through what we can do to assist our clients accessing products and solutions, but also how we transition our own business model along the dimensions of E, S, and G as well.
That's great. It's so nice to, it's nice that you have both sides of that, the client side of it, and of course for your own firm. Robert, how about yourself? You've been doing this for Philips. We've talked previously, but I know that there is there's obviously going to be this Philips spiel around it, and there's always going to be, what we talk about, sustainability and, the broader terms. But for you as someone managing this and trying to make these transitions happen, how do you think about sustainability and sustainability strategies to that end?
Yeah, let me build on what Lydie has been saying. I think it's really about the E, the S, and the G, right? So it's much broader than the environmental impact, of course. Maybe another lens to add to that is the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, right? That a lot of governments, NGOs, and our customers are also looking at. So maybe building on what indeed Lydie was saying, I think it's really important to think through where your organization or company can really have material impact, right? And discuss this with your key stakeholders, with your customers, with your investors, with your suppliers, and then really zoom in. As Philips, we are a leading health technology company with the goal to improve 2.5 billion people's lives by 2030. And when we talk about materiality, then it is about health and well-being for all, which is one of the SDGs, number 3. And on the environmental side, it's really about climate action, right, and of course, materiality. And I think Rob will talk about the circularity in more detail, but of course, that's an key element to really also reach the climate goal. So if you ask me what does sustainability mean in a context, I think it's a core part of our strategy, of our purpose. And of course, it needs to be really practical, starting with your own operations, but involving your suppliers and most of all, helping your customers to also really drive positive social impact and within the boundary conditions of the one planet that we have.
Thank you for that. We'll talk more about the ecosystem that you have to create around sustainability. Rob, I'd love to hear from you quickly from the MacArthur Foundation's perspective and from what you're working with, especially with folks like with Robert. How do you think about it?
Yeah, I think if we think about sustainability, it really all starts with where do we want to go. And historically, a lot of the focus in the sustainability conversation in particular is going to go around how can we reduce the harm of the business, particularly on the E side of things. How can we use a little bit less water? How can we use a little bit less energy, shrink our negative footprint? And that's all really important, but ultimately that doesn't quite tell us where we want to go. It's not very inspiring to say we want to become less bad. And increasingly the conversation is starting to shift towards how can we actually have a positive impact as a business, as an economy, and Robert mentioned it just now. And that's where we believe our work that we're doing at the MacArthur Foundation with the circular economy plays a really important role in actually building an economy that can work in the long term and not just be less bad, but actually deliver positive outcomes for people, the environment.
That's a great point, and we're gonna touch more on circularity, but I want to start with the point that you made about kind of looking at this historically. So I guess, for all of you, what is the starting point? It seems like sustainability there's a moving target, right? And so what is the starting point for thinking about corporate sustainability, especially, and we'll get to, in the context of corporate purpose, Lydie, you work with all sorts of companies and clients kind of across the spectrum. How do you think about it? And, what is the first thing that you think about for clients on the strategy end of it?
Sure. Well, as Rob just mentioned, really diagnosing your starting point, both what your business model is and what it could become along these dimensions. And for us, we're a financial services institution. So we lend capital and we provide access to products and services that allow our clients to express their own perspective or express what our chief investment officer recommends. So our real our fortress is our ability to provide that access either through financing or through products and services and insight. And so that's really our core objective, is to really assist in having our clients accessing the transition or whatever version of the sustainability journey they want to, including, by the way, to Rob's point, financing new technology, new innovation, new ways of solving potentially the climate crisis or the healthcare crisis. So there are a number of dimensions by which we as a financial services institution can really use our core DNA to help our clients engage with sustainability. And on the other end of the spectrum, then, we have to look at what our track record has been in that regard and, what we do that may be harmful or that may have to transition itself. So that's really our balance sheet, or where we spend our money. So which vendors we use, which suppliers we use, and what is the kind of knock-on and supply chain effect of all of that work. So, we happen to be a financial services institution, so we play in the financial domain of assisting our clients through the financial system. But we also have our own balance sheet and our own payments that we carry on forward with as well. And that's really, we have to keep both ends of that spectrum in mind and then work through, again, according to our strengths and our historical DNA and our strategy, really how we can assist in that journey.
Right. It's interesting because, then you look at a business like Philips, right, which is not obviously very different, but again, the goals and, Robert, we were talking about this last time, is the difference between a sustainability strategy and setting that up kind of next to your core business versus being sustainable and actually putting that, putting your money where your mouth is. From the context of Philips, how does that look?
Yeah, thanks, Anjani. I think that's a great observation indeed. I would like to say you don't need a sustainability strategy. You need a sustainable strategy, right? So that means really moving from Friday afternoon activities to having it at the center and really peeling the onion from starting from the company purpose, to long-term objectives, mid-term objectives, short-term objectives, and really landing it in a day-to-day decision-making so that you, for instance, if you do portfolio management or if you look at specific innovation projects, not only look at what is the profitability outlook in the next 3 to 5 years, but that you also really understand what is the social impact, what is the environmental impact, what does it mean for different stakeholders, including suppliers. So trying to make it really, really practical and move beyond financial reporting to integrated reporting, and from there to integrated decision-making, really empowering every stakeholder in the organization to having that perspective. I think that is the core of the transformation that we are talking about. And then, of course, you need financial institutions, right, like Lydie was talking about, to help you finance the transition. We issued sustainable innovation bonds 2 years and 3 years ago to really invest in refurbishment center, where we are applying things that we've been learning and developing together with the MacArthur Foundation to refurbish large-scale medical equipment and bring that to the customers. But it comes back to these micro decisions and really making that an integral part of how you live, basically, and not just to these do-good, feel-good kind of activities that you talk a lot about, but you do on a Friday afternoon, because that were the first ones that you also saw got killed during the COVID crisis. When businesses get under pressure, they divest or reduce everything that's not core. Sustainability needs to be part of the core.
And that's exactly why.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
I just
Rob,
want to say, I could.
Please come in.
Thanks. There's a little delay. I just want to say I couldn't agree more with that, both Robert and Lydie, and that's that really integration of what is the purpose and what do we want to achieve into the core business, into the products and services you put in the market as a company. That's really where we believe it should go. And I think the good I would say a good news in that is that the research we've done over the years has confirmed over and over and over again that whatever industry we look at, whatever geography we look at, there are massive, massive opportunities when we look at the circular economy specifically to score both better environmental and better economic outcomes. And to just give you one example of a report we published last week looking at the fashion industry, where for decades the growth in the fashion industry has been fueled by putting ever cheaper products on the market, and that has had, not unsurprisingly, of course, a massive negative environmental impact, but also has been actually really negative for the profitability of the industry, and profit pools and average profit margins have been going down. And we've looked at what would be the potential for circular business models, so for fashion companies to go in and derive revenue not just from making ever cheaper stuff, but actually to derive revenue from, for example, reselling, renting, repairing clothing. Right. And the opportunity is massive, 700 billion opportunity by 2030, and could become 20% of the industry by 2030. So that's just one example of how we can look for better growth in the core business, better products and services that deliver both on economic and environmental objectives.
That's a great point. Especially you bring in the example of the fashion industry. And just the other day, I was looking at, I think LVMH or someone is doing vegan leather sneakers. They're all starting to change up and really make this a bigger point and bigger part of their strategy. But these are great practical steps. But how do they really, how do we really turn these sustainability related steps into profit? Is vegan leather really going to is it really that much more sustainable than leather? And is it, that's just one example because you mentioned the fashion industry. But I guess I want to, Lydie, in your context, how do you think about practical steps? What really are practical solutions?
Yeah, well, and I'm going to forget if it was Rob or Robert who made this point before, but this is really about creating sustainable, durable business strategy. So these things are not mutually exclusive. In fact, in a perfect world, it becomes a flywheel where the sustainability just builds on itself, and you are creating a more durable, future-proofed, profitable enterprise. And we know that's feasible, and maybe depending on which industry you're at various points of inflection for building that flywheel. But consumer demand has shifted so substantially to really have this be at the forefront of consumer sentiment across the economy globally, but in that, of course, varies by sector. But there is appetite around pricing. Consumers are in general willing to pay some sort of green premium, and again, that varies depending on which sector you're in. And as that green premium, as Bill Gates calls it, gets reduced, this will become self-fulfilling in some sense. Now, at the base of this is experimentation and the appetite for innovation.
Right.
So whether it's vegan leather or if it's transitioning legacy energy infrastructure, right. There has to be some tolerance for medium to long-term planning and innovation, and the cycle time for that innovation to actually pay off. And I think that's, from my perspective, one of the most challenging parts of this, because, we live in what tends to be a very short-term investor sentiment, short-term shareholder expectations.
Yeah.
And so creating enough pockets of innovation and building a glide path where you can see that profitability and the ROIs really coming through is really the art here. And I think in general, increasingly investors are understanding, shareholders are understanding that these are going to create more durable companies with better outcomes, whether it's with their employees, with their shareholders, with the communities in which they operate. But these are not all quick fixes, and we need to create some of that kind of expectation that this is very future oriented. So it really is about creating the arc, the narrative, and the actual innovation and investment that goes into creating the future strategy.
Absolutely.
Maybe can I build on that, Anjani?
Absolutely, please come in.
Because it triggers a couple of points. So I really see three different steps. Your question was how you make it profitable, right? But I think the first one is understanding impact, environmental and social impact. So also being able to have the right metrics in place to track and to use these, not just to report, but to really optimize your portfolio and your business strategy. The second one is understanding how this impact creates value for your various stakeholders. And I'm not talking about monetary value. I'm talking about value in a broad sense, like broad welfare, right? And understanding that is also really important. I think only the third step is then inventing and co-creating with your customers the right business models that allows you to monetize a fair share of the value that you have created for your company, so that you are able to reinvest, to pay the interests to the investors, of course, and to really scale the innovation. But these are really three important steps, and that require long-term thinking that Lydie was referring to. That's one of the things that we have been doing over 2021, the entire summer, with all of Philips businesses, basically, is really working on 5-year innovation roadmaps to hit our 2025 targets on the way to 2030. So that was really helpful, just saying, okay, for a specific business, what do they need to deliver in terms of circularity, design criteria, energy efficiency of the product portfolio, the way how they bring products and propositions into the market, for instance, in circular business models. Because if you have this 5-year horizon, then you can talk about capability building, you can talk about milestones, you can talk about continuous funding, and you get away from this quarterly kind of, sometimes I have money, otherwise not, right? And then you get the kind of traffic light reactions, which do not really help that continuous innovation that Lydie was referring to.
And I guess that's kind of where, to the point that you raised, I think that's kind of where, as companies and, different sectors transition, in some sectors, to Lydie's point, in some sectors it'll be accepted faster. In some sectors it won't be accepted as quickly. And then in some, so you end up with the spectrum of leaders and laggards in this transition. So, where do you see, what is the single largest difference between the leaders and the laggards? Is it purely just a function of the business model or the sector? Or is it really, they haven't set targets? Their strategy is, a sustainable strategy versus is a strategy around sustainability as long as it's convenient, versus a sustainable one that kind of gets them to these 5-year targets or 3-year targets, or, whichever works, I guess. Rob, where do you see that? And in the work that you do, what is the single largest difference do you see between these kind of groups of companies and that are trying to transition?
Yeah, thanks. And I think thinking about that, I think there's probably many differences. I'm thinking about a single unifying trait between the laggards and the leaders. Setting the targets for the leaders certainly is often a first step. Then, as Robert was talking about, setting the roadmaps to actually deliver on those, engaging in the partnerships, the collaborations, the innovation, thinking about how to integrate in the core business. That's certainly all elements that put them apart. We have been thinking a lot about over the years about how do we actually get the laggards to move up to the level of the leaders. Yeah. We work with many leaders as an organization, and we've really found two ways. One is to work with the leaders to push the ambition even further. And one example we have there is from the work we've done around plastics and packaging, where we worked back in 2017 with Unilever to come forward to set an ambition to make all of their plastic packaging 100% reusable, recyclable, or compostable. We then went to Unilever's competitors. We got a few more, and now we have more than 1,000. So, but all of those thousands can be changed, can be tracked back one way or another to getting that first leader to step up and show the way. The other way, of course, is through policy, and I think that's where we haven't talked a lot about policy, but that's where policy, of course, can play a really meaningful role to level the playing field and get the laggards to step up as well, because that's another thing we've consistently found through the work we've done. Through voluntary action, voluntary industry action, we can get a really long way, and we can show what's possible with a group of leaders, and we can drive the innovation, et cetera, et cetera. But to get from that initial 20-30% of leaders in the market to 100%, that's, in our experience at least, really, really hard to do through voluntary action alone, and is something where at some point government needs to step in to help scale those innovations and those actions from that group of leaders to the rest of the market.
Well, from our experience, I'm sorry. No, Lydie, go ahead, please.
Go ahead,
I wanted to say, from our experience, there are a couple of elements that you need to drive such a transformation. And it starts with this narrative that people really understand and buy into, right? And that can be something anchored in science-based targets, and the global climate crisis, that could be industry-specific, maybe, if you really want to talk customers. But so you need a narrative. Then you need to engage the leaders, as Rob was saying. I believe the single most differentiating factor between leaders and laggards is leadership. So really, you need people that step up. And also on a personal, credible level, step in times of uncertainty and lead the way. And then, of course, you need to build capabilities. So, for instance, we are now working with our supply chain to have 50% of our suppliers signed up to science-based targets in 5 years' time from now. So that means you need to also assist them in the transformation and build capabilities jointly. And the last step is really also embedding that in your system. So creating financial incentives for people that are following the good path, so to say, baking in sustainability and ESG criteria in your core processes, remuneration systems, you have it. So I think that are the 4 things that really drive change also in the industry.
It's a great point.
Yeah,
Lydie, would you like to jump in there?
Sure, yeah. So I'll take a contrarian view for a second, which is that the kind of the acid test of leaders versus laggards, and it's obviously quite useful in some sense to have both ends of the spectrum. But we all know that one of the challenges here is the lack of regulation or consistent regulation, the lack of consistent policy, and the lack of consistent or widespread disclosure means that it's very hard to analytically easily compare all the leaders versus the laggards or the entire universe of corporates. But there are certain acid tests which are pretty important, some of which have just been listed by my fellow panelists. And I think that over time, we will have more of a baseline benchmark of understanding, either people are on a journey or they're off the journey, and it's kind of, and it's, to me, that's the first test, and it's back to the credibility. Is it embedded in their strategy? Have they adopted science-based targets? Do they have people working on this? Do they have leadership assigned to it? There are certain very just integral, specific questions that if those ingredients don't exist, they're not. Then the corporate's just not even on the. They're not even on a journey to having this be part of the discussion. So I think the leaders versus laggards is helpful. It's an important way of thinking about this. And in fact, we do this often when we think about our research. But I would also suggest there's another way of thinking about it, which is much more binary, which is are the ingredients for success even on the table and part of the management team's decision-making and the board's decision-making? And you can usually see through those quite quickly. And those have a lot to do with, SASB, TCFD, SBTI, all the kind of acronym soup that we all know about. And that's another way of thinking about whether or not, the issuer is even started down the path.
It's great because, part of it is also a question around whether there's purpose or intent.
Purpose and intent. I mean, this is a question of leadership, right? And I think and corporate values. And so and we're talking in quarters and years, not days, weeks, months. And so this really has to be infused starting from the top, and at some point it's just about sustainable strategy as opposed to sustainability as part of the strategy. And so again, an acid test is, where is it in the purpose statement or in the vision statement or the values of the firm? And if you don't see it in that kind of collateral, then you may, in fact, be able to you should be testing for whether it's a legitimate exercise for the firm.
And I guess that's where, part of there's also then what's achievable, if it is even part of the purpose and intent statement, and it is what these management teams are striving to get to. Where do we think about, the intersection of employers and employees, and how do you really get the buy-in from your employees and to really move ahead? If you want to talk about sustainable strategies, that's all well and good, but what actually works? And for people like you and me, who are all employees of big companies at this point, and we can talk about it, but how do we get to it on a personal level? Robert, I know you have a lot to say about this, and so I'm going to let you jump in here.
I'll keep it short for the sake of time for my fellow panelists also. But one of the things that we did, of course, really try to look for a scalable model of how to help people connect their personal purpose with the company purpose. And that, of course, is tricky, right? I mean, if you have a friend or a colleague that you know very well, you can sit on a coffee table and have these type of discussions. But how do you facilitate that discussion with 80,000 people around the globe? So one of the things that we did last year is we started with a town hall meeting with our CEO, Franz van Houten, and myself, discussing the importance of sustainability ESG for our customers and our company, then gave it to the country CEOs, and then had facilitated roundtable discussions in small groups where people were really talking about what inspires them, what's important to them personally, and how it relates to the company goals, and then really drilled that down to a level where it became smart and measurable, basically, objectives that were meeting both criteria, and they became part of the target setting discussion for 2021. So I'm not saying that's the silver bullet, but it was a very interesting experiment to look exactly for that intersection that you mean between what drives me as a person and how does it relate to the company objectives or the purpose.
Yeah, and I guess that's what we've kind of come out of COP26, and we've realized that we need so much more individual action too. Rob, I know we have very little time, so I'm going to let you do your 10 seconds.
Well, I think for me, it comes back to, is the vision that we're going towards actually inspiring? Are we trying to become a little less bad? Imagine raising your children like that, become a little less bad. It's not very inspiring, but are we actually going to a place where we are trying to make business a force for good in the world and have a positive impact through our products and services? And, well, in the interest of time, that's my contribution.
Lydie, I want to come to you, but we're going to have to leave it since we're out of time. Thank you to all our speakers for joining us today. We're grateful for your participation and perspective. And to our audience, both within and beyond the Bloomberg community, thank you for joining us. Please follow the conversation with @Bloomberg Live on LinkedIn or Twitter, or like us on Facebook. And to learn more about our upcoming events, please visit the website at bloomberglive.com. Thank you to our sponsor, Carney, and everyone who joined us today. Don't forget, you can watch this on demand. Thank you and stay well.